you can see that I have, for each theory, right, or each approach, up here at the top we have how it understands sex, the concept, how it understands the concept of gender, how it understands the concept of sexuality, and then, of course, as I mentioned, the relationship between all three. And so to save space, you can see I've abbreviated S for sex, G for gender, SY for sexuality, right? So please just keep that in mind as you note my shorthand throughout. Okay, so as I mentioned, right, biological approaches think that sex is fixed, meaning that it's not something that it can be changed, right? It's whatever it is at the moment of one's creation, right? However you envision that, right? Although with naturalism, of course, that's going to be through evolution, right? So however those factors are determined, right, by nature, that's how they will remain. They're not capable of change throughout one's life. And so because of this, we have, unfortunately, an incorrect understanding of naturalism here, in that biological approaches to sex and gender typically only assume that there are two biological sexes, male and female, and that these two things are opposites. But of course, as we already know, these are not the only two biological sexes that are possible. We have what we call intersex individuals, what were previously called hermaphrodites, but again, there are many different combinations of internal and external sex organs, and so there's quite a variety more, right? There's not just two biological sexes that one can be born. And again, if we're talking about nature, if we move beyond the human species and look at non-human animals, we can see that in certain species, there is actually the possibility in nature for their sex to change. What is it, seahorses or something, right? Where the seahorses are when the males carry the babies. So starfish, there's some sea creature that actually changes its biological sex so that it can engage in what is called asexual reproduction, right? It can reproduce all on its own by switching its biology to have both the male and the female sex organs necessary to create life, right? So again, unfortunately, even though the biological approach does think that sex is determined by nature, it has an incorrect view of nature, unless you're looking at like maybe a newer biological approach, of which I haven't seen any. But biological approaches typically mistakenly assume that there are only two biological sexes that occur in nature. And they're going to maintain what is called the principle of coherence, which means that your sex is going to causally determine and be identical to your gender, and they assume a heteronormative form of sexuality, meaning that the quote-unquote correct sexual orientation is to match these opposites together, right? They consider this to be a quote-unquote natural pairing, although again, this is an incorrect understanding of nature. There are many species of animals, including humans, who engage in same-sex behavior, right? So this is, again, unfortunately based on an incorrect understanding of nature, but this is the view nonetheless, and is probably the one you grew up learning about, right? Again, heteronormative, this is the norm that we live in, is the biological approach, the most limited of them. So because of this principle of coherence, there is really seen to be no difference between sex and gender, right? So when you hear those terms used interchangeably, you're probably dealing with someone who maintains one of these theories under the biological approach, right? And so your sexuality is simply a property of your gender, right? It's a facet of being a woman that you're attracted to men, right? It's a facet of being a man that you're attracted to women, is the idea. And of course, working backwards causally, that gender, right, identifying as a man, identifying as a woman, is believed under this view to be directly caused by your biological sex. Okay, so I'm going to come back to the cultural approach because I want to go in order, right? So moving on to the second most inclusive approach, these are the interpersonal approaches. So moving now beyond just your body, your individual, physical nature, to a notion of how your sense of self gets developed through the people who are in your life during primarily the first 5 years. These are the most formative, according to psychologists, is in the creation of our sense of personal identity, right? So there are other things, of course, that come later on and that we're constantly developing psychologically our entire lives. But again, when it comes to your sense of who you are, right, it's really the first 3 to 5 years of your life that the primary development of that comes in, right? Which is why it's so difficult and challenging and often traumatic, right, for people to question their identity later in life, because it's so deeply ingrained by that point. There's really no part of our lives that's not affected by that. So it's important to note that these interpersonal approaches are typically corresponding to certain approaches to psychology that were dominant at the time. And so this includes psychodynamic theory, social learning theory, and cognitive development theory. These are just different explanations as to how our interactions with other people in those first couple formative years really have a causal impact on who we are. So psychodynamic theory typically ends up being something closer to Freud, right? Freudian psychology, and the idea that your relationship with your immediate parents, specifically the opposite sex parent, right? Although there's a break from the mother that every child needs to make, that those are the relationships that will define every aspect of your identity, but especially your sexuality. So if you haven't studied Freud, it's fascinating. We still use a lot of those ideas today. He thought that, the reason that women, or those who identify as women, are attracted to men is because they had what he called penis envy, right? And so there are these other interesting facets that have to do with the Electra and I'm blanking on the other one, right? These sort of Greek names, but these complexes where someone is in love with their parent of the opposite sex because they didn't make the right transition, right? They didn't learn how to redirect that attraction to someone else.